Hi, and welcome to the intro video for Multifamily Modeling's Waterfall Collection product. This product features 8 different waterfall structures, and 3 of which feature both 3 and 4 tier versions. After purchasing this product, you'll receive 3 Excel files, one for monthly, one for quarterly, and one for annual versions of the collection. As you'll see throughout the models, we've made it easy to copy and paste each waterfall into an existing cash flow model. Let's get started by looking at the various models and the different structures. And for full descriptions of each waterfall, please download the PDF on the product page. Each waterfall tab has the same formatting. Your structural inputs are in blue font in the top left of each tab, and anywhere you see blue font with a green background, you'll link those cells to your cash flow model. For example, in row 27, you'll link your total equity contributions down here to the equity contributions from your cash flow model, and in row 29, you'll link your net positive cash flows from your existing cash flow model. And at the top in cell H3, you'll link the start date. The waterfall then handles the rest. In this tab, we have a 3-tier IRR-based waterfall with the cash flow distributions determined by project level IRRs. It reads as follows. Tier 1, cash flows are pari passu until both parties receive their return of capital plus an X% compounded return, or IRR. All cash flows above Tier 1, so this is Tier 2, until a project level X% IRR are distributed X% to the GP and X% to the LP. So what this is saying is both the GP and the LP get their capital back plus a return that gets them to an 8% IRR. And then everything above that 8% IRR up until a 15% IRR is distributed 25% to the GP and 75% to the LP. And then in Tier 3, all cash flows above Tier 2 are distributed X% to the GP and X% to the LP. So everything above a 15% IRR is distributed 40 to the GP and 60 to the LP. Each tab is then structured in the same way. You have project level cash flows at the top, and these cash flows flow through each tier of the waterfall down to cash flows by capital partner, where the cash flows are summed up for each of the partnership entities. So let's take a look. At the top, you have project level returns based on the cash flows you bring in from your cash flow model. And then you have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and your cash flows by capital partner with returns for each of the partnership entities. Now we also have a check at the bottom to make sure everything's adding up properly, and we have checks in each tier to make sure the IRRs are being calculated properly. And this is the case throughout each tab in the model. So let's take a look at a few other tabs. Next, we have the 4-tier version of the waterfall we just walked through. So it's just an additional tier in here, an additional hurdles added. And then next we have a 3 and 4-tier version of a slightly different IRR-based waterfall. Instead of the IRRs being based on a project level IRR, it's based on the IRR to the limited partner. And that's an important distinction. And so there are 3 and 4-tier versions of this. There is then a 3 and 4-tier version of an IRR-based waterfall with a separate promote tranche. So what happens here, on cash flows above Tier 1, the GP receives an X% promote, and the balance of proceeds is distributed pro rata to the equity partners until the equity partners achieve an X% IRR. So let's take a look. And this waterfall requires your circular references to be enabled. So down in Tier 2, well, after Tier 1, we have cash flows to Tier 2. So first, the GP is getting a 10% promote. And then the balance of the cash flows are distributed 10% and 90%, in this case pro rata, between the GP and the LP. And then everything above that flows to Tier 3. And so in this tier, there's an IRR check and then a second IRR check to make sure everything is calculating properly. And then in Tier 3, which is everything above Tier 2, it's a simple promote of 30% to the GP, and the balance is 90-10 to the GP and the LP, and then your cash flows by capital partner below. There's a 4-tier version of that. which just adds in an additional hurdle with the GP promote first. And then we have two different catch-up structures. So in this first one, cash flows are pari passu until both parties receive their return of capital plus an X% compounded return, or IRR. And then tier 2, the GP receives 100% of cash flows until they've received 20% of the total project level profits. In tier 3, the balance of the proceeds above tier 2 are distributed 20% to the GP and 80% to the LP. So what's happening here is we have our typical preferred return, in this case an 8% IRR, return of capital, 8% IRR. And tier 2, we're catching up the GP, so they're getting the entirety of the proceeds until they've received 20% of the total deal level profits. And then everything above that is distributed 80-20. So in this case, you see that 20% of the total deal level cash flows have gone to the GP and 80% to the LP. Now, if you don't have enough cash flow from your deal to achieve the full tier 2 hurdle, then the distributions to the GP will be less than 20%. But in no case should it ever be greater than 20% for this catch-up, unless you choose it to be greater than 20% above. Now, there's a second version of this in which the GP receives 100% of the cash flows until they've received 20% of the total project level profits in tier 2. But in tier 1, the limited partner is receiving 100% of the cash flows until they've received their invested capital and an X% preferred return, compounding monthly IRR. So in the previous version, in the catch-up 1, tier 1 was pari passu, meaning GP was also getting 5% of the returns because they contributed 5% of the equity. But in catch-up 2, all of the money is going to the LP first, and then the GP is caught up. So this provides more protection to the LP should things go wrong. Next up, we have a couple different return on capital structures. And in this one, return on capital 1, the GP and LP each receive a non-compounded pro rata preferred return of X%. So this is not an IRR. This is just off of cash flows. In tier 2, the GP receives an X% promote on cash flows above the preferred return. And remaining cash flows after the GP receives this promote, all cash flows are distributed pro rata to the GP LP equity. And in these return on capital structures, you'll see two additional line items that you need to link up to your cash flow model. There's your cash flow after debt service is split out separately from your net proceeds from refinancing and your net proceeds from sale, because the return on capital models, or waterfalls, they keep track of your outstanding equity balance and as it's paid back from those capital events. And then we have return on capital 2, which is slightly different. So in tier 2, the GP receives an X% promote on cash flow from operations above the pref and an X% promote on cash flows from capital events after all equity has been returned to the partnership. So this is bifurcating these cash flows. The cash flows from operations and the cash flows from capital events. And that's why we have our net proceeds from refinancing and our net proceeds from sale broken out over here. And the calculations are taking place down here in tier 2, where your different promotes are split out. A 35% on cash flows after your return of capital, and your 30%, in this case, on cash flows from operations above the pref. And finally, we have an equity multiple structure. So this is a 4-tier equity multiple waterfall. You have your typical 8% pari passu preferred return, 8% IRR. And then tier 2 is everything above that 8%. You're going up until 1.5x equity multiple is 25.75. Everything between a 1.5x multiple and a 2x multiple is 35.65. And everything above a 2x is 45.55. And we can see that taking place down here where we have checks. Here's what's required to achieve a 1.5x multiple. Here's how that money is distributed between the GP and LP. And then here's a check just to make sure it is in fact 1.5x of the total. Same thing down below. And then tier 4, which is everything above tier 3, is split as follows, 45-55 in this case. And their cash flows by capital partner with a final check. So that's the full intro to our new Waterfall collection. Let us know if you'd like to see anything added. I'm sure we'll be updating this as time goes on and redistributing to our clients. And let us know if you have any questions.